Hello. This is a bonus lecture, if such a thing exists, for our Disciples of Christ History and Polity class for the Center for Ministry and Lay Training with Phillips Seminary. And I wanted to talk about a few things that I hadn't quite gotten into the other lectures, formally speaking. Might not even be vitally necessary, but I think would be of interest to a student of our history, to a leader, whether in worship or in congregational life for the Disciples of Christ. And it has to do with publishing and prophets and hymnals. When it comes to the hymnody of the Disciples of Christ, we don't really have a large store of unique hymnody in, say, the way the Methodist Church does. Charles Wesley, John Wesley's brother, was quite the musician. He wrote many more than John, but both of them contributed greatly to the store of hymnody for the Christian church in general and in Protestantism in particular. And probably in the Disciples' Church, you have more people who know "Oh, for a thousand tongues to sing" than they do many of our other disciple favorites. And of course, being a people who from Alexander Campbell on were very focused on communion every Sunday, there are certain hymns that we hold close and hold high. Let us break bread together on our knees being perhaps foremost among those. And of course, blessed be the tie that binds to conclude a service. Those are a part of our history, but they're not necessarily rooted in our heritage, not exactly. But we are a singing people, and Alexander Campbell spoke quite a bit in the pages of the Millennial Harbinger about how the hymnal is right behind the Bible in terms of its significance in our formation, our Christian formation, how we, especially on the congregational level, develop our shared theology. So he was concerned to select the right hymns, and he did engage in that, although he never really wrote that many. We've got a few from his hand, one of which is in Chalice Hymnal. But I want to go back to the very beginning and help you think about how hymnals were, and so are, a part of our life as a fellowship as well as in congregational life, and how that's changed, and what some of those changes tell us about our polity, our structure, our governance, and our funding. And when it comes to governance, we can spend a lot of time on foundational documents, but miss the key element of how we pay the bills, which itself is a part of polity that perhaps is understudied, but central, as anybody who's worked with church life or nonprofits in general knows all too well. But let me go back to the earliest days of the Disciples of Christ and on the frontier for Protestant churches in general. Hymnals were a private affair. The church didn't tend to own a big stack of them, let alone having them in racks in the pews. Many, of course, on the frontier, if we're back in the 1830s, 1840s, had benches before they had pews. And if you had a hymnal, you owned it yourself. And this was really true for, well, at least our whole first century and on into the period, I'd say, starting from World War I forward, it became the norm for a congregation to have hymnals, for individuals to be less likely to have their own. But this is an 1835 hymnal, and you can see, I have to play with the background function here, but you can see the size relative to my hand. And if you're thinking, well, how did people back then who had poor eyesight, or how did the elderly read? Well, that itself points out something to us, which is it was assumed that once you got elderly and feeble enough, you simply stopped coming to church. We didn't talk about ramps or assistive technology, let alone projection screens. So that's right. If you don't have really good vision, and I had that upside down there at first, but you can see how small the print is. You'll also notice there's no notes. Most of the singing was a cappella. Now, we get into the a cappella branch a little further on, and this is a good reminder for almost all of the churches on the frontier, a piano, let alone an organ, was almost an unimaginable luxury until you get into the later 1840s, 1850s, and then after the Civil War. And this itself becomes a part of the economic and social distinction between North and South, between urban and rural, and between what becomes the disciples of Christ and the a cappella folk, is if you can't afford something, it certainly helps to say, well, we wouldn't have it even if we could afford it. And I'm not trying to argue any kind of disingenuousness on their part, but that's where the reinforcements, I think, could have come from. At any rate, nobody in the first few decades had musical instruments. You had a song leader who may or may not be the worship leader. Again, we're kind of back to the future on that in church life these days. But you have meters noted, a rhythm. And if you're not quite sure what it means to address a meter as opposed to a tune, it has to do with how different sets of lyrics could all fit to certain tunes. And in fact, when you go back to this early era, the average congregation might know 3 or 4 tunes, and you would simply sing the words that would fit to those tunes. The best parallel I can think of is, well, you might know with the doxology. And you might know a song that was the theme song for a TV show called Gilligan's Island. And you might know, or no, I'm thinking of Amazing Grace. So, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see, was blind, but now I see. That's meter at work. The doxology, Hernando's Hideaway, you may have sung this at church camp, you know, praise God from whom all blessings flow, praise. You get the idea? Different meters are a rhythm which can fit different songs. We're used to thinking just in terms of tune, but also the tune driven by professional or at least skilled musicians who are leading from the organ or from the piano. Nope. Individuals would have hymn books, families would gather around. Perhaps if you couldn't afford one, you'd sit next to somebody who would let you kind of share, if indeed you could see it from where you're at. And this was how congregations learned new songs, found the ones that fit the tunes they knew, perhaps added a tune every year or so, but those were the restrictions they worked under. And again, it was individuals who bought hymn books. This is an interesting one because it's an 1835 hymnal out of a related tradition, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is the hymnal that was selected by Joseph and Emma Smith. In the 1830s, we still had more in common than separated us. And that could be a whole bonus lecture of its own. But I happen to be up at the Kirtland Temple in Ohio, which is operated by the Community of Christ, which is itself a separate branch of the Latter-day Saints tradition from the Salt Lake City Church that's much more commonly known. And they had these for sale. So they're reprints, but they're absolutely to scale in terms of size and, of course, the typeface. Our first hymnal in the Disciples of Christ tradition, Christian hymn book, was selected and published by Alexander Campbell at Bethany, then Virginia, now West Virginia. And this Christian hymn book, again, is about this big, a little bit thicker. This one has not quite 600 different tunes in it, but you'll note no music, no notes, just meter. So you go through and find the meter that fits the tunes that you know, and then you fit the songs to them. And if you find a song whose words you like, but the meter doesn't fit anything your congregation knows, you either have to learn a new meter, a new rhythm to make this work, or you just skip it. It's interesting, almost 600 hymns in here, and there's maybe a dozen that would be familiar to you. It shows you how things keep changing in worship life. We think we're going through the first or the biggest revolution with contemporary Christian music versus, well, traditional worship or the classic hymnal. But this 1851 hymnal bears almost no relation whatsoever other than 2 or 3 hymns total to, say, Chalice Praise or Chalice Hymnal. It does have Hark the Herald Angels Sing. It does have a few others that we would recognize, but not that many. The thing about this hymnal, and I'll try to open it to the title page here, is the Psalms and Hymns and Spiritual Songs, which were selected by A. Campbell, W. Scott, B.W. Stone, and J.T. Johnson. J.T. Johnson was the fellow who shook hands with Raccoon John Smith in 1832 to bring together the Stonites and the Campbellites as the Christian church really got itself going. And it's adapted, you'll note, to personal, family, and church worship. And Campbell knew that many times worship might not be able to be for a family coming, say, 10 miles into town to attend the meeting house. So you'd have family worship. Again, individuals and families bought hymnals. The meeting house itself didn't have any, or maybe just one or two as a courtesy. This is a 5th edition, so it's not that valuable, and I can manhandle it a bit. Published in 1860, but as it says there at the bottom of the page, Bethany, Virginia. This continued to be published well through the latter part of the 1800s after Alexander Campbell's death. And the interesting thing to me is this hymnal and the sales of it were devoted by Alexander Campbell, who had a fortune himself from the estate of his first wife, that he didn't need the money, he didn't keep the money. This was the hymnal that basically covered the expenses of the wider church, the American Christian Missionary Society. And he essentially signed the copyright over, and the proceeds for it went to them. And it was after Campbell's death in 1866 published in its later editions in Cincinnati. So you see where having kind of a, not a monopoly, but at least having a primary option that went through you meant that then churches and individuals are paying you for the privilege of having this hymnal. And then that becomes some of the money you use to pay the bills. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in later weeks as we talk about how the general church, how regional churches, or what used to be state societies, let alone how congregations pay their bills. It's not always just in terms of individual weekly offerings. And in fact, if you look over a 200-some-year period, less often than not, is it individual gifts on a recurring basis. So looking at where the funding comes from, very worthwhile. Now, this one is very hard to read, very hard to make sense of. It's Union Hymns from the for Sabbath schools, and it's published for the use of the American Sunday School Union. And it was compiled in 1871, and this one happened to be given in 1873, and it was given to my paternal grandmother's father. Now, they were Congregationalists, but the American Sunday School Union was one of the first more ecumenical efforts on the American scene, not so much that churches were working together, but the idea of Sunday schools were originally a separate endeavor to some degree from congregational life. And the question individually was, would a church adopt the Sunday school plan? And if so, would they adopt their pattern of having their own brief worship, their own curriculum? And of course, then you have to buy, or people purchase to give as gifts, as was given to my great-grandfather, their own hymnal, and of course, the curriculum. Again, start to see where, not just being cynical here, I'm being practical. Where does the money come from and how does the money flow? And paying for regular curriculum is a great way to have a consistent income stream that allows you to support a wider work. So we see that with the Sunday school movement. And in fact, that too became one of the causes of separation between the a cappella and independent churches of Christ and the disciples of Christ. Our folk tended to say, Sunday school sounds interesting. The other branches of the Stone Campbell or Restoration movement said, wait a minute, Sunday schools, not in the Bible. And it's money going somewhere else outside of the congregation. So they tended to stand against that. Well, come down to another that's very special to me. Now, it also tells us something interesting about church history. It's Pentecostal hymns. And it would be easy to see this and think, well, this has nothing to do with our history. Our people aren't Pentecostal, are they? Well, the Pentecostal movement in the United States and in some ways in the world generally traces itself back to Los Angeles in 1906. And if you don't know anything about that history of the Pentecostal movement, I recommend you look into it. But for a lot of Pentecostal church groups, such as the Assemblies of God, when you read their history, they'll not only talk about the Azusa Street Assembly in 1906, which itself was triggered by the earthquakes in San Francisco and the people in Los Angeles being both fearful that one might come, an earthquake and fires that follow to strike them, but thankfulness that they were spared. And in the course of that thank meeting, the Spirit was poured out on them. And again, the Pentecostal revival in America, and to some degree, again, the world began. But most Pentecostal historians, such as the Assemblies of God, will point back to 1801 and Cane Ridge, a first spark, a flicker of the Holy Spirit at work. But Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell tended to turn away from more emotional and outward expressions of the Holy Spirit. And certainly even down to today, we don't tend to see ourselves as Pentecostal, but this hymnal was given to my maternal great-great-grandmother. And it was actually a very common hymnal in Disciples of Christ churches in the late 1890s and through the early 1900s into about the 1920s. Pentecostal hymns 1, Pentecostal hymns 2. This is Pentecostal hymns numbers 1 and 2 combined. And I think they went down to like a 6th volume coming out of Hope Publishing, which if you sing in your church choir, I'm betting you'll go, oh, Hope Publishing. I recognize them. They're still around. Out of Chicago, but Henry Date was the fellow who compiled this hymnal, and you can barely read it. No point in my even trying to game it up close to the lens. So I'll just say, Miss Rosa Cartwright's book, December 9, 1903, steal not this book for want of shame, for in it is the owner's name, presented to Rosa by her father. Daniel Cartwright gave this to her, his father Joseph Cartwright before him. This is a sign and symbol of the fact that I'm fortunate enough on my mother's side to be a 6th generation disciple of Christ. But while Pentecostalism, as we understand it today, didn't exist yet really in 1903, it was still that spirit of Pentecost that we find in the Bible. In Acts chapter 2, what it means to sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, a question Campbell wrestles with. And also in the early churches, we're looking for a simple way to be not the only Christians, but Christians only, and go to Acts 2:42, following the blessing of Pentecost and how we come together again and again for the breaking of bread and the prayers, the apostles' teaching, and fellowship. So through this story, we see a number of different ways that we as disciples have gotten a hold of the tools for worship. And I'm sitting here in front of an image of the Campbell Study, which you can still visit at Bethany, West Virginia today. But from Campbell's printing press right down through the controversies over the Christian Standard out of Cincinnati and the Christian Board of Publication, which still exists today as Chalice Press. We wrestle with how will we pay for what we do, and how can we get churches to participate in common materials rather than turning outside to obtain them from other traditions, which themselves might teach us or at least influence us in ways that are different than our heritage. We'll come back to that again and again in the readings and in the upcoming lectures. But for now, I hope you just enjoyed getting a chance to see a few of these hymnals and get a little bit of that angle on our story as disciples of Christ.